Hey guys, it's Max. Today we are going to be talking about this $2,000 piece of metal, which is Apple's Afterburner card, and ultimately answering the question, is it worth $2,000 specifically for different use cases, and maybe trying to answer that question for you guys. So I was actually probably most excited when Apple announced the Mac Pro, not for the Mac Pro itself or better CPUs or graphics, but for this card, which is something brand new, something that is specific to video editing, and I had a lot of questions. I know you guys did as well. So we'll be answering, does this help with encoding to ProRes or other formats? Does it help with background rendering? What about transcoding? And what about playback? And how much does it help? And is it worth spending that much money? We'll look at 4K footage, we'll look at 8K, and also 16K project. And in some cases, this $2,000 card can outperform a $7,000 processor with 28 cores that Apple offers. So let's start out with kind of the simple question that a lot of you guys have. Will this work in an eGPU? And that's a huge question I had, and unfortunately, no. I did actually have to partially take apart the case, plugged it into the GPU, it connected, but nothing showed up, and ultimately, after running different tests to see if it worked, it really didn't do anything. So maybe it could still work in, say, a Hackintosh that is set up to fool macOS into thinking that's a Mac Pro. We might have to try that, but at this point, you cannot use it with a Mac Pro, which is very unfortunate. Now, will other codecs be used with the Afterburner? Personally, I do not think so, even though it can be reprogrammed. Apple designed it specifically for ProRes and ProRes RAW and for Mac use. And for other codecs, I think it makes a whole lot more sense to have acceleration with graphics. For example, Red RAW is very difficult to play back, and it's all CPU based right now, just like ProRes was. They're actually working on a metal playback or rendering engine, and that should be released soon. It's actually done right now, and that makes way more sense than allowing the Afterburner card to be able to play that back, because not that many people are going to have Afterburner cards, and everybody's going to have a graphics card, whether it's in form of an eGPU or a nice graphics card in a MacBook Pro. I think that makes a whole lot more sense to do that. Now, before we jump into the performance section, where I'll tell you where it helps a lot and where it doesn't help at all, let me give a shout out to Micro Center for making our Mac Pro content possible. Micro Center has 25 stores nationwide with an impressive variety of electronics, from gaming, VR, computer parts like processors, graphics, and everything else needed to build or upgrade a PC or Mac. Micro Center has been an Apple authorized dealer since 1980. They have a dedicated Apple department with highly trained sales associates. Aside from the iPhone, Micro Center carries the full lineup of Apple products, and they have the largest selection of third-party products made for Mac and iPad. Come into a local Micro Center today and talk to one of their Apple experts to order the specific Mac Pro configuration that best suits your needs. Check the link in the description to find a local Micro Center near you, or browse all of Micro Center's Apple products. Alright guys, now let's jump into performance, but I do want to let you know the configuration that I have for the Mac Pro. I have a 12-core model with 192 gigs of RAM, which is overkill, but I paid maybe a third of the price of what Apple charges, so it kind of made sense. And then I also have the Vega 2 graphics card with 32 gigs of HBM2 memory, and of course, the Afterburner. Now I want to start out with playback, because that is what Apple advertises for this card, being able to decode ProRes RAW and make it easier on your system. So starting off with just 4K ProRes RAW, without the Afterburner card, it actually took about 20% of the CPU and maybe about 10% of the graphics card. It was super smooth. And then putting the Afterburner card back in, now we're running about 2% on the CPU. So that is showing that the Afterburner card is taking the load off of the CPU, but in either case, this is super easy for a system like this to take it to another level. We're taking a look at 8K here. Now, I could not get my hands on true 8K ProRes RAW footage, so I had to kind of make some myself by combining 4 streams of 4K ProRes RAW, and this is at least as difficult as 8K, or maybe slightly harder because there's different end times and start times, but it does simulate it quite well. I talked to different people online about this, and playing this back without the Afterburner card used about 70% of the CPU and about 35% of the graphics. So this is where the system is starting to get heavy kind of load on it, and it still has no issues at this point. But if you did have ProRes RAW that was at 30 FPS or 60, or you added, if you had multicam here, or even if you had an 8-core processor, your system would be struggling. putting in the Afterburner card, we went from 70% usage to 5% CPU usage. So basically just above idle, and 25% graphics. So it took a little bit of a load off the graphics card as well. That means that we have a ton of overhead and our CPU is really doing nothing at all. So now we had to take it to another step further because Apple didn't advertise it as, one stream of 8K. They first advertised it as being able to play back 3 streams of 8K, and then they upped it to 6 streams. Now I didn't test 6 streams, but I did test 4 streams. So I made a 16K project, and there is 16 4K clips raw at the same time inside of there. It's simulating 4 streams of 8K ProRes RAW, which is absolutely just insane in my mind. So I started playing this back with the Afterburner card, and I started having issues at first, and then I realized that actually the system looks fine. My SSD was bottlenecking, and I have a really fast SSD, so I transferred everything to the internal, and bam, that solved it. And now we're playing back at almost perfect with just a little bit of dropped frames. And I was like, why are we dropping frames here? It looks like it's smooth, but I could tell by the timeline the playhead is just slightly skipping. And that is actually because the graphics card was completely maxed out. That was our bottleneck, not the CPU, not the Afterburner, our high-end graphics card. So if you're somebody who's gonna edit 4 streams of ProRes RAW with effects on there, you better get 2 of those graphics cards, the Duo, or just plop 2 of them in, because you're gonna need that performance. Even then, our CPU was only running at 8%. So we literally could have a dual core processor and it wouldn't matter because the Afterburner is doing all of the work. Now I removed the Afterburner and we had issues. Now everything flopped. Our CPU is at 100% usage. Our graphics card is now at 30% usage. And we're playing back at, it seems like maybe 5 to 7 frames per second. Super stuttery. And then as far as reading the SSD, our SSD is only reading about 400 megabytes per second, where it should be more like 1200 or like 1400 because of how much footage we're pulling out right now at the same time. And basically our CPU can't handle it. And our graphics card is chilling because the CPU is bottlenecking the graphics card. So in reality, the CPU is bottlenecking it by about 2/3, or only giving about 30% of what the GPU can handle. And this actually means that even if you spent $7,000 on a 28-core processor, you still would not be able to play back 4 streams of 8K or 16 streams of 4K just because it's too difficult for the CPU to do. You absolutely have to have the Afterburner, but you'll be able to, even with an 8-core processor, you'll edit 6 streams of 8K ProRes RAW. On Apple's website, they actually say you can have up to 3 Afterburner cards in your system. Is it 18 streams of 8K? You could do that. And I guess supposedly it works. Now, what about for the rest of us? So if we're not doing 6 streams of 8K ProRes RAW, well, even though it doesn't encode, it actually does have some benefits. So I first off started taking a ProRes RAW timeline and exporting to ProRes. So that would be for a master file if you just want to take that later and encode it using some other software. Here, with a 4K project that's 5 minutes long, we went from 2 minutes and 45 seconds down to 1 minute and 45 seconds. Basically, instead of needing 20% of your CPU resources to decode and then leaving the remaining for encoding, it has extra CPU power. So that was nice. And then if we take a step up and we take a look at 8K, an 8K project, and here I went to ProRes, the highest quality, 444XQ. Here we went from 20 minutes and 18 seconds down to 12 minutes and 50 seconds. So not twice as fast, but that is a massive improvement. Even though this does not encode ProRes RAW, being able to take the load off there. Now, what if you're somebody that is not dealing with ProRes footage, or you're not encoding to ProRes? Well, one thing that you could do is background rendering. Well, I did a test, background rendering, an almost 12-minute project, and there was literally no difference because we're not starting off with ProRes, we're starting off with H.264 footage, and the CPU and GPU have no problems with this. that it just takes the same amount of time. So if that's what you're hoping for, you really don't have any benefits. Now, a lot of you guys also asked, what about transcoding to ProRes? People asked about a couple different codecs, Red RAW, either C200 RAW, files from like say Sony cinema cameras. It's H.264, but it's in that different wrapper. And so I tested all of those, and literally there was no difference whatsoever transcoding from those other formats to ProRes. I kind of expected it because this card does not encode ProRes, and to decode those other ones, you're either using the CPU or the graphics card, and there was no difference between any of those, as you guys can see. So now to answer the question, is the Afterburner card worth it? Well, if you're working with either multiple streams of 4K ProRes RAW, and I'm talking about at least 4 streams, but even then, you probably want to go higher than that. 6 streams, 8 streams of 4K ProRes RAW multicam, then possibly, or especially if you're working with 8K or you're gonna be working with 8K ProRes RAW, absolutely. Now, if you're somebody that doesn't get your files natively from ProRes or maybe transcode overnight, and if you're just transcoding on the spot, background rendering, or you're encoding to other formats, and your whole workflow isn't centered around ProRes, especially the high-end ProRes, it is not worth getting this card. Now, for those of you guys who do have that kind of a workflow, but you're wondering, should I get maybe an 8-core with Afterburner or a 16-core, without it? I would probably say if you already are shooting natively with ProRes or you transcode overnight, then yes, get the Afterburner card because you have all those system resources remaining with your CPU and go down. I wouldn't say get the 8-core, at least get the 12-core, but in that case, it is worth it. And for those of you guys who do that crazy high end, this can be a lifesaver. And some people might buy Mac Pros just specifically to be able to have this card that will be able to be used. And for now, it's just Final Cut. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Afterburner isn't some magic card that you have to program in. If DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro or any other programs, if they're using Apple's Video Toolkit, which is a way that they can just plug in to get access to the T2 chip encoder, to the graphics card encoder, that will automatically use Afterburner. So as long as they're doing that and they make sure that it's configured properly, it's not like they're gonna have to spend months trying to get this card to work. It should be fairly easy the way Apple set it up. And not only those editing programs, anything that will play back ProRes RAW should have access to that. For example, Edit Ready, other players, as long as they're going into Apple's pipeline, it will work. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know any questions down in the comment section below. Any comments, I'd love to hear you guys' opinions. Once again, thank you for Micro Center for sponsoring our Mac Pro content. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next video.